Chapter 12 Gary's Problem. The next morning, just as they arrived at work, Carl came up to them smiling, excited to find out how the tutoring session went. Gary thought the excitement was to check up on how his money for hiring the tutor was being spent. He was anxious to respond, but Tony answered first, telling Carl how happy he was with the tutoring session and that he was looking forward to the next one. Gary then cut in, saying that he didn't think very much of the tutor because she was over an hour late in getting to the apartment and that Carl should find another tutor. The atmosphere between the three instantly became thick and uncomfortable. Tony cleared his throat while shuffling his feet looking down. Carl's smile immediately disappeared. The silence dragged on as Carl paused, staring at Gary, who held his gaze for just a moment before he too looked down and away. Then Carl, in a matter-of-fact tone, told him that he knew she was late getting there because she was with him at the store going over some paperwork before he let her go to their apartment. Gary now felt the awkwardness that he'd created after recognizing that Carl was defending her and sensing there was more to what he was saying than just explaining why the tutor was late. Something about the way Carl was looking at him made him realize that he'd said something wrong. Gary struggled, trying to make things right. Okay, I just thought you should know, that's all. But he already knew that it was too late, that he'd crossed some line, he just didn't know which one, and now he felt even more uneasy about the tutor. Carl left them, and Gary and Tony returned to work, with Gary making a mental note to stay as far away from the tutor as possible. He decided not to be there when she arrived for the next tutoring session. She wasn't there to tutor me anyway, he concluded. When the day of the next tutoring session arrived, because they both had the day off from work, Gary woke, got dressed, and went straight to the mall. He ate breakfast there, and afterwards spent hours in the food court. He then went to see a movie, intent on staying away from the apartment until he thought the tutor had left. When he got back home, he found Tony in the living room playing the video game and sat down beside him. Tony put down his game controller and began to talk. He told Gary about the good time they had studying and that he'd learned a lot. Her name is Nisi. Carl is her great-uncle, and Thelma is her great-aunt. Gary now began to understand why Carl reacted the way he did when he told him about her being late and wasn't even listening to Tony anymore. He was lost in his own thoughts and feelings, more surprised at how resentful and jealous he was feeling because Tony was enjoying her company. We talked about how when she was younger, her mother was hooked on drugs and made life difficult for her at home. Because of the way her mother treated her, she figured out that the only way of getting out was a good education so that she could go to college and move out. So she decided to really apply herself at school. She told me that no matter how good she did at school, her mother would deride her and tell her that she wasn't anybody special and that she was never going to amount to anything. She said it was because of this kind of behavior from her mother that she studied even harder and was able to graduate from high school early. Tony paused and looked at Gary. He got the impression that he wasn't listening to him at all, but he continued anyway. On the day she graduated from high school, her mother told her that if she was smart enough to graduate from school, then she was smart enough to make it on her own. She said she wanted to leave, but wasn't ready to go when her mother put her out, so she made her way to the homeless shelter where she met a nice lady who worked there. They talked every day and eventually became friends. Then she told the lady about her mother and how she ended up at the shelter. Then the lady offered to take her in. The lady told her that she'd lost her child to the streets and that's why she was working at the shelter, so that maybe one day he would come into the shelter and she would be there to meet him. This made her think because she never thought that a mother could love her child so much, and she felt sorry for her. Then, she said, She came to think of the lady as the mother she never had, and stayed with her until she got accepted and left to attend college. That's how she came to be a tutor. She had a lot of questions about you, Gary. I think she likes you." Hearing that she was interested in him, Gary started paying attention. Surprised at hearing his name, he began trying to recall what he heard Tony say when he wasn't paying attention. What did she want to know about me? Oh, so now you're listening. Together, they both started laughing. Okay, you got me. But when is she coming back? On our next day off. On the day before their next day off, Carl approached Gary and asked how things were going with his studying for his GED. He made sure to think before he answered and measured his response to Carl's question because ever since that day he made that remark about his niece, Carl had barely spoken to him at all. Gary cheerfully said that things were going great and that he was sure he was ready to pass the exam. Now, don't go getting cocky, but if you feel that good about it, I'm going to need you to come in and work tomorrow. Gary caught the hint. Carl didn't want him anywhere around when his niece was at their apartment. "Bright-eyed and bushy-tailed," Gary responded, trying as hard as he could to sound unaware of Carl's real motive. He got to work the next day as usual, grateful when he arrived that neither Carl nor Thelma were anywhere to be seen. The morning wore on, and then just at lunchtime, Carl came from the back of the store heading straight for him. Gary immediately saw him approaching, looking directly at him as he got closer. Gary felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. He began making notes in a mental journal about how it feels when you're about to get fired. Carl came up to him. "I need to see you in my office." Gary noted that the tone in Carl's voice wasn't one of anger like he was expecting, or even commanding. It sounded more like anticipation. Even so, it caused him to feel worried. As he began following Carl, he momentarily recalled the uncomfortable feeling he had after telling Carl that the tutor, then mentally corrected himself, his niece, was late, and realized that he did not feel that way at all right now. Puzzled and becoming frustrated at trying but failing to figure out what was happening, he finally concluded that he was getting fired, saying to himself, "May as well just go and get it over with," and continued following Carl to his office. When Carl reached his office, he pushed the office door open but didn't enter. Instead, he stepped back out of the way, then turned around. Confused, Gary stopped in his tracks and looked at him. Carl, looking back at him, gestured with his head for Gary to look into the office. Gary shifted his gaze. There, inside the office, standing next to the desk, was his mother, and standing next to her was his stepfather, Travis. Chapter 13. As Luck Would Have It. Because of her first experience with a boyfriend and her mother's reaction to it, Denise decided at 12 years old that she would have no more boyfriends. 2 years later, at 14 years old and in the 9th grade, she'd remained steadfast to her decision. She'd already begun taking the classes at school that allowed for her to begin fast-tracking to college. She was sticking to the plan she came up with at 8 years old to get away from her mother. She even volunteered to attend summer school, anything to keep her from being in the house with her mother, whose drug use always intensified during the summer months. After Denise turned 15 years old and nearing the middle of her 10th grade semester, she learned that she had already acquired enough credits to graduate from high school. Around the same time that Gary was running away from home, she was planning her graduation. After she graduated, she was put out of the house by her mother. She made her way to the homeless shelter, where she was befriended by a woman who worked there. In time, the woman invited her to come and live with her. The woman was divorced and had a spare room at her home because her son had run away from home. Denise brought what little belongings she owned with her to the woman's home, and saw pictures in the living room of her now ex-husband and her son. She immediately recognized the boy in the pictures as Gary. She excitedly began talking until Deborah calmed her down so that she could understand what she was trying to tell her. After she calmed down, she told Deborah about the events that led up to her meeting Gary and the conversations they shared over the phone. As Deborah listened, the memories came flooding into her mind, the memories of when her life was good and complete, back when she was married to the man she loved and her son was happy and at home. She suddenly remembered the evening when she and Travis overheard Gary on the phone with her, the night when she first snapped at Travis just to be mean. Only now, as she listened to Denise, because she was no longer consumed by the bitterness she felt for Travis at leaving her, she began regretting how she'd taken his love for granted. Overcome with emotion, Deborah suddenly started sobbing and then burst into tears, getting up and running out of the living room and into her room, slamming the door closed behind her. Startled, Denise sat alone in the living room for a moment and realized what she'd done. With a lifetime of experience upsetting her own mother, almost instinctively, she got up, collected her bags, and left the apartment. After she had gone a few blocks, walking away from the apartment on her way back to the shelter, Deborah caught up with her and was able to convince her to return to the apartment. As they walked back, Deborah explained to Denise what she was feeling and what happened that night between her and Travis. She was able to convince Denise that she was not upset with her, and together they returned to the apartment. Over the months that followed, they rejected their meeting as coincidence and instead came to see it as one of the things that you would never see coming, as an act of providence, illustrating God's glory, and they formed an unbreakable bond. Every day they spent hours talking with one another, enjoying each other's company, and rejuvenating each other's outlook on life. Through these conversations, Denise came to see that where her own mother viewed her pregnancy with her as the reason her life went down, Deborah looked at her pregnancy with Gary as the reason her life went up. She recognized and matured, learning at a young age the valuable wisdom of choosing the right perspective to view situations that you find occurring in your life, especially situations that you have no control over. And it was Deborah, in talking with Denise, who came to learn about herself, that she had unknowingly fallen into depression after her divorce and losing her son. She'd imagined herself as strong and unbreakable, but now, with her frailty exposed, she recognized that the real reason she had chosen to take the job at the shelter was a way of hiding from the rest of her life. With this newfound understanding, Deborah decided to make changes in her life for the better. One of the first things she decided to do in rebuilding her life was to return to attending church. Denise had never regularly attended church. Her grandmother was always too busy as a lawyer, and her mother, understandably, never had any interest in church. So it was Deborah who introduced her to attending church and to the congregation. The pastors and elders at the church were very excited to see Deborah in attendance once again. They spoke with her, and when they learned the reason for her absence and the events that led up to her returning to the church, they asked both her and Denise to give their testimony before the congregation. After Denise began attending and meeting people in the congregation, she began to realize that the world was not as bad a place as her upbringing had shown it to be, and for the first time, she began to trust other people. Deborah, with her confidence restored, applied for better jobs than working at the shelter and got an unexpected offer to train and work as a paralegal from James Carver, a member of the congregation who was a senior law partner at Prentice and Van Meyer, a prestigious law firm in Philadelphia. Denise, who had finally gotten the one thing out of life that she so desperately wanted, which was a mother, no longer felt the need to excel at academics. She got a job working fast food and settled into just living with Deborah and basking in the feeling of being wanted. So much so that after 6 months had passed, she had to be encouraged by Deborah to apply for college. Understanding why Denise had ignored pursuing college, and though pleased by it, Deborah began working closely with her, almost having to push her into choosing a college. Deborah especially recommended that she apply for a college in her mother's hometown. Because while she was an orphan herself, Deborah impressed upon Denise the need to build a connection with her mother's family, and by the time the acceptance letters from the colleges started rolling in, Denise needed no further encouragement to accept the invitation from the college in her mother's hometown. Chapter 14. College. When Denise arrived at college, she realized immediately that she missed being able to talk to Deborah as much as she missed her grandmother in the days immediately following her passing. The first thing she did was to use the last of her money to buy a phone card. After learning the location of the campus phones, she was able to call Deborah and did so every day without fail. Before the end of her first week away at school, Deborah had to help her to overcome the homesickness that she was feeling from her absence. She had been on the verge of leaving college and returning to Philadelphia to live with Deborah. It was only after their last conversation that Denise was able to finally devote her time to unpacking her bags and moving into her dormitory room. For some unknown reason, the college had given her a choice of room assignments after being accepted. Because of my high GPA, she thought. She chose to have her own room instead of sharing with either one or two other students, but she was now considering changing her room choice because she felt alone and wanted company. While she was contemplating changing rooms, there was a knock at her open door. Startled from her thoughts, she turned to see the grad student resident advisor, or RA, for the floor that her room was on, standing in the doorway but leaning with her back against the wall. "Hi, Denise, is it?" The RA was pointing and squinting at a name on the clipboard that she held in her hands. She never looked up at Denise. "I'm the RA for this floor. My name is Monica. Everybody just calls me Mo. Are you okay? Is everything working out? Are you finding everything? Is there anything you need help with? We're here in the office down in the lobby whenever you need us." Mo asked all of the questions rapid fire without waiting for a response, all the while leaning back against the wall. Now, however, she became focused on cleaning her fingernails. After hearing no questions from Denise, she looked up from her nails, seeming to remember at the last minute to manufacture a smile. The lack of concern that Mo felt was being purposefully made evident. It wasn't only in her facial expression, but also in the fake and completely fabricated smile that she wore that was openly clashing with the disinterested look on her face. Mo had quickly gone through all the questions that she was supposed to ask and was only doing her job, nothing more, and she made sure that Denise knew it. As she stood up straight from leaning on the wall without a word, she began turning to leave the room. Then, as if it were something she remembered at the last minute, she stopped and produced a slip of paper from her pocket and placed it on the desk near the door. "This message was dropped off for you," then without another word turned and left the room. Denise opened the envelope to find a handwritten invitation for her to spend the weekend at her great Aunt Thelma and Uncle Carl's home, where she would be introduced to her relatives, the other members of the Robinson family. The message went on to include the details and location where she would be picked up that coming Friday afternoon, and then returned back to the school on the following Sunday afternoon. As she read the message, she was instantly cautious and skeptical. There was no reason to trust this message that was just delivered by Mo, but also because she was trying to figure out how anybody in the Robinson family would have known that she was at the school. Not even her own mother knew. The only person who knew she was there was Deborah. Soon she began to recall her grandmother talking a little about the Robinson family back home, telling her stories about things that happened before she and Carol moved up north, but she couldn't remember any details. Then, in a flash, she heard Deborah's voice from just a few months ago telling her how important it was to connect with her mother's family. So, despite having never met any of them before, she decided that she would be at the pickup point, if for nothing else, just to see what happens. Her first week at college went by very fast, it seemed, and before she knew it, she found herself running late to be at the pickup point outlined in the invitation. She made it to the parking lot in front of the school with only minutes to spare before the 3 o'clock rendezvous. She looked at the parking lot and saw it was almost full. With so many vehicles, she wondered how was she supposed to identify who was there to pick her up. Her confusion then turned into suspicion again when she saw 4 groups of people begin walking towards her from 4 different vehicles, calling her name and waving as they advanced. She looked from one face to the other as they drew nearer. "I'm Phil. I grew up with your mama," she heard a loud voice say. "I'm your Auntie Sharon," another voice called out. The crowd of people were coming steadily closer, and she thought, if I'm going to get away from these people, it's now or never. But the thought only lasted a second. Although these people were complete strangers, the feeling she had about them that started as suspicion quickly became something else, something closer to pride. Watching them approach, she could feel it deep inside and somehow knew that they were all family. Everyone looked well-to-do, and she had the sense that they had not dressed for the occasion of meeting her. Instead, they seemed to be dressed that way because they not only had money, but were very comfortable having it. When they reached her, all talking at the same time, Denise could not make out any one thing that was being said in particular, but some of the older women were saying how much they could see how she favored Jacob, her grandfather, and then reached out, stroking her hair. Others there began hugging her, the men shaking her hand, one of them reaching for her bag, offering to carry it for her, but still feeling cautious, Denise politely declined. Once the excitement of seeing her died down, came the introductions, and each person offered a brief explanation about how they were related. Denise struggled to take it all in, and finally they all began escorting her towards the vehicles that they had come from. She walked with them, listening to the chatter, flattered by all the attention she was receiving. Now, getting a better look at the cars they had come in, she saw that they were all different high-end late-model SUVs. She was familiar with the makes. She saw a Mercedes, a Cadillac, a Land Rover, and a Lincoln. When asked which she preferred to ride in, she chose the Escalade, which she thought was the most modest choice. The excited talking from her distant relatives continued as she rode with them, closing the distance that she felt towards them. She was taken to a gated neighborhood where she marveled at the size of the homes, but no one else in the car seemed impressed. Soon they arrived at her great aunt and uncle's home. It was a huge mansion, the biggest house on the street, and the biggest Denise had ever seen, not to mention having ever been inside of. As everyone got out of the vehicles, they all made their way through the huge double doors, and were warmly welcomed with hugs by the many people who were already inside. The Robinsons made a big fuss about welcoming her, and a huge cookout was already underway by the time she got there. For a brief moment she wondered what would have happened if she had chosen not to come, but the thought passed as quickly as she was caught up in a whirlwind of people hugging her, taking selfies, and talking to her. Denise knew that she had to quickly overcome feeling uncomfortable around these people, having never before been this close to as many people at the same time. She was surprised to learn that her family, the Robinsons, were a large, well-known, and well-respected family in the Jacksonville area. Then she was introduced to the owners of the mansion, her great-aunt Thelma and Uncle Carl. They both seemed like down-to-earth people, not at all what she expected them to be like. There was no pretense about any of these people, she thought to herself, surprised, because her ideas about rich people being bougie were quickly dispelled. She slowly began to relax in their company. She was shown her room, where she would spend the weekend, learning that the celebration was to last all weekend long. She met her many other relatives and cousins, and soon she was laughing and enjoying herself. She was really surprised when she learned that the whole affair was in her honor. There was even a DJ set up and playing music. The afternoon gave way to the evening, when suddenly she remembered and made time to call Deborah. She told her about meeting her relatives, and the size of the house that she was in, and what she'd learned about her proud family history. She described to Deborah a painting that hung over the fireplace in the great room at the estate. It was a painting of her great-grandfather, Jack, his wife, Mary, their two sons, Jacob, her grandfather, his brother, Daniel, and their sister, a baby in the painting, Valerie. She was thrilled at learning of her family's rich and exciting legacy, so very different from what she ever expected growing up in and out of foster care and in fear of her mother. Before the weekend visit ended and she returned to campus, Denise learned from her great aunt and uncle that they sat on the board of directors at her college and knew she was enrolled because they were among the ones who decided what applicants were accepted or rejected to the school. Afterwards, they discussed with her the opportunity that they'd arranged for her to be able to earn some money, offering her the job of tutoring an employee of theirs that needed help passing his GED test. It was during this conversation that she learned that Carl and Thelma owned the St. John's grocery store, the largest independently owned grocery store in Jacksonville. Plans were made for her to meet with her aunt and uncle next week at the store to discuss the details of the tutoring job that they'd offered her. Denise returned to school after the weekend with her family, and as soon as she opened the door to her room, she recalled the last time she was in the room, feeling alone and wanting to change rooms. Now she felt complete, no longer lonely, and then counted her blessings at not having to deal with Mo for anything. When the time came, she arrived at the grocery store on the day she was to begin tutoring and joined her aunt and uncle in the office to go over the background and educational information they had on Tony, the employee that she was supposed to tutor. The store maintained files on all of their employees, and her attention was drawn to a photo she saw attached to another file. What she saw was a photo of a boy that looked like Gary. At this point, she hadn't seen him in years, not since the party that night when she was 12, so she wasn't positive, but she was very curious. She asked her uncle about the boy in the photo on the other file, and was told that he was the roommate to Tony, the student that she was supposed to tutor. But he's not the one who needs tutoring. He is a very bright young man. He came to us by chance after running away from an orphanage where he was being abused, Uncle Carl said. She waited until her uncle finished talking, growing all the more curious while staring at the photo. Then she asked if the boy in the picture was named Gary. At this, her aunt and uncle looked at one another in amazement. "Yes, how did you know?" Denise suddenly felt as if she couldn't breathe. Then she immediately felt lightheaded, and everything that she saw in the office became fuzzy white. And then she fainted. She came to and found herself on the couch in the office, amidst a flurry of emergency medical technicians checking her pulse and taking her blood pressure. Because she was on her back lying down, she tried sitting up, but the technicians told her to lie still and just relax. She lay back and, looking across the office, saw her aunt and uncle pacing back and forth nervously. She called out to them, and they came rushing to her side. She apologized for causing them to worry, and explained that she felt fine now and was just overcome by the news she heard concerning Gary. They told her to just relax and let the technicians check her out to make sure, so she just lay back silent so that they wouldn't worry about her anymore. As soon as the EMTs left, she excitedly began telling them of the events of the last few years. She told them about the situation at home with her mother and noticed the look that Thelma and Carl gave one another. She continued telling them about the unbelievable way she came to meet Deborah, Gary's mother. When she'd finished, they expressed their amazement at her story, but then cautioned her not to get Deborah's hopes up. They had to remind her that the boy they knew as Gary told them that he was an orphan. Denise was almost certain that it had to be the same Gary that she knew from back home, but she also realized that her aunt and uncle could be right, and there was the possibility that she could be wrong. So instead of calling, she decided to write Deborah a letter after she got back to the dorms, telling her of what was happening. Because whether the boy turned out to be Gary or not, she felt that Deborah had the right to know what was happening. Also, by the time the letter arrived, she would know for certain. Later that day, when she arrived at the apartment for the tutoring session, the boy, that could be Gary, opened the door. She stood there looking at him, certain that this was him, but she hadn't seen him since the birthday party 5 years ago, and when he showed no sign that he recognized her, she chose not to say anything about it because she still might be wrong. It was after she got back to the dorms at her college that she wrote the letter and mailed it to Deborah first thing the next morning. 2 days later, the anticipation had become too great. She got on the phone and called her, but got no answer and had to leave a voicemail. She left the message filling Deborah in on all the events that had recently transpired and ended the message with the suggestion that she come down and see the boy for herself. Chapter 15. Deborah. In the days just before Denise left to go to college, Deborah made it a point to keep encouraging her to go and did her best to keep Denise's spirits up about leaving. She had to put on a brave face, and when the time came for Denise to go, she made it as joyous an occasion as she could. But after Denise left, the reality of being alone set in, and Deborah felt herself once again, slowly but surely, falling back into depression. She did her best to fight it, but just knowing that she could fall into depression was not enough to prevent it from happening. It was when she was home alone that she soon realized she was the most vulnerable. It was during those times that she began being visited by the memories of Gary and Travis, starting her on the road to depression just like before. Only now, it was worse than before, because now her memories of Denise began to surface as well. She realized that the best way to prevent herself from becoming a victim of depression again was to stay away from home, working extra hours as a paralegal for the firm, even if it meant working off the clock. The weeks after Denise left for college slowly ticked by for Deborah, but the work that she had been putting in got the attention of Dieter Van Meyer, one of the 2 founding partners at Prentice & Van Meyer. Dieter was the only active remaining founding partner at the firm and was nearing 70 years old himself, the other founding partner, Mark Prentice, having all but retired last year after turning 75. During the firm's weekly meeting, Dieter asked the lawyers about Deborah, having noticed the large amount of additional work he had seen coming across his desk lately with her name on it. When he checked with Human Resources, he found that she had not put in to be paid for the extra hours it must have taken to prepare the papers. In response to his question, James quickly remarked about how quickly she'd completed the training to become their paralegal. Almost all of the other lawyers agreed and commented on how efficient she had been to each of them in only a short period of time. Dieter was convinced that it was her dedication to the success of the firm that fueled her work. Then, after hearing that all of the lawyers in his firm agreed that Deborah was a remarkable employee, decided that even though she'd only recently completed the training and was now working as a paralegal, It would be a benefit to the firm to begin fast-tracking her through the training, enabling her to earn an associate's degree and serve as assistant counsel to the firm. Everyone in attendance agreed. The following day, James called her into a meeting with Dieter, himself, and the other partners, where she was presented with the firm's recommendation to advance to the position of assistant counsel. Dieter explained to her, "All you have to do is agree, Miss Smith, and I will have the firm pay all of the cost of the classes and the training required, if you would be willing to serve as assistant counsel to the firm. It will be much more difficult than the training you've completed to serve as a paralegal, but the firm could use someone with your enthusiasm as assistant counsel. Take a few days to think it over, and let us know at next week's meeting, Miss Smith." She thanked Dieter and readily accepted the opportunity. "I look forward to starting as soon as possible." For Deborah, it was perfect timing to keep her away from the empty apartment and a way to keep her mind occupied on things other than the absence of Gary, Travis, and Denise. "Great, then. I will leave you in the care of James, and he will get you started. Again, I want to thank you personally for all you have done and will do for this firm, Miss Smith." Later, James told Deborah that she should feel very proud of herself because Dieter Van Meyer was one of the most respected lawyers in the state. Deborah quickly settled into her new routine of performing her paralegal duties during her normal work hours, and immediately afterwards studying and training to earn her degree. It kept her in the office from 9 in the morning until 9 in the evening, 5 days a week. She still dreaded the weekends that she spent at home in the empty apartment, and it was only through the weekend phone conversations with Denise that she was able to keep the depression at bay. She had been working this routine for less than a week when the workload changed, due to the firm having to go through its yearly accountability inspection by the state. Because her workload increased significantly, she was forced to forego answering Denise's daily calls, and they went straight to voicemail. After a week, James informed her that the workload associated with her training for assistant counsel was about to increase as well, now entering a more demanding phase. But by now, she was determined to finish the training and handle the increase without complaint. With all this going on, she was nearing exhaustion, but because the inspections were coming to an end, she persevered, with a renewed determination to stick it out, knowing that she would soon be returning to a less hectic work schedule. Still, she found herself sometimes too tired after she got home to make her normal call to Denise or even listen to her voicemail. One day in particular, she got home later than usual and went straight to sleep. She woke up the next morning running late, still tired from the day before, and had to rush out the door to make it to work on time. She didn't have time to check her voicemail the evening before, or even that morning. It was not until she was on her lunch break that she found the time to check her messages. As she listened, it was the voicemail from Denise when she was visiting her family for the first time, telling her about the events that had taken place since she'd arrived at college and about being hired as a tutor. She was so happy for Denise that she became invigorated and all the feelings of exhaustion vanished. The heavy workload that she had been handling since last week that had her feeling exhausted was now easy to accomplish and had returned to being seen as a blessing, preventing her from becoming a victim of depression. By the weekend, however, the feelings of exhaustion had crept back, and she decided to stay in bed the entire weekend. Not only because the feelings of depression were coming back, but because she was physically drained. The beginning of the next week found Deborah still tired and again running late that Monday morning. This time, when she found time to answer Denise's voicemail, she heard Denise telling her about the letter that she had mailed. She never remembered any other part of the message after hearing Denise tell her about the boy that she met and thought was Gary. The only other thing Deborah remembered hearing from the same voicemail was Denise telling her to come and see for herself whether the boy was or was not her son Gary. Deborah became very excited while listening to the part about her son in the message. Then, after listening some more, she became frantic. She still had a full work day ahead of her, so she sought out Sue, the office manager, and explained the ongoing situation to her. She made sure to emphasize the possibility of her son being located after having run away from home, in the hopes that she would sympathize and grant her immediate time off. "With these inspections pending, we really can't spare you time off, Deborah. But when the inspections are over, you can put in for time off through the proper channels if you still need it." Frustrated, Deborah immediately put in for 2 days off, Monday and Tuesday of the coming week, as the inspections were scheduled to conclude that coming Friday. She called the airlines and made a reservation to leave for Jacksonville on Friday as soon as she got off work. When she got home later that evening, she tried to get Denise on the phone, but her call went to voicemail. She left a message telling Denise that she would be in Jacksonville Friday evening. The next day at work, with only 2 days before she planned on leaving, Sue approached her during her lunch break. "Your request for time off had been approved, but because you are in training for assistant counsel, you needed to have the time off from training as well, and I'm sorry, Deborah, but you failed to submit the request, so I had to deny your request for time off." Sue turned to leave, but Deborah grabbed her arm and stopped her from leaving. Sue, unable to keep walking, shocked and with eyebrows raised, looked down at Deborah's hand on her elbow. "Wait a minute. I told you, I have a chance to find my son. I need this time off." Sue only stared at Deborah's hand on her elbow, then tried unsuccessfully to remove it. "If you can get time off from training as assistant counsel, then I don't see any reason why we can't grant your time off request." With this, Deborah released her grip on Sue's elbow. Sue then took a few steps back, far enough that Deborah couldn't grab her again. Then she squared her shoulders and stood looking at her. "To get time off from training, you have to go through the proper channels, Deborah, and submit a properly filled out request form 2 days in advance. The request is then sent to the office of the senior partners, where it will be reviewed, and you will hear an answer back within 5 working days. Okay?" Sue smiled at her, and not waiting for a response, turned and walked away. With her back still to Deborah, she said over her shoulder, speaking much louder than necessary, "Don't be late in coming back from lunch now, you hear?" Deborah became angry. The anger then rapidly turned into frustration. She was on the verge of losing it completely. She briefly considered chasing Sue down and smacking her to the ground. She saw herself doing it, when suddenly she had an idea and decided on another course of action. She decided right then and there that she was going to go find her son, whether she had time off or not. So with this decision made, the rest was easy. Faced with the likelihood that if she left she was going to lose her job, she now felt like she had nothing to lose and made a last-ditch effort to get the time off. She went over Sue's head and went to see the senior partners directly. She was taking a big risk, but it was a calculated one, because James, the senior partner she chose to go see, was the same member of her church congregation that heard her and Denise's testimony and recommended her for the paralegal position in the first place. It was still during the lunch break, and she figured that if he was in the office, at least he wouldn't be working. She walked from the cafeteria and across the courtyard of the firm and went straight into James's office, over the objections of his secretary yelling, telling her that she could not go in there. Deborah continued into his office, pulling the door closed behind her, silencing the objections from his secretary. After she finished explaining to James the events taking place regarding her son, he immediately approved her time off request. He said she could take as much time as she needed, and that when she returned, she could resume training for assistant counsel. As Deborah was leaving the office, she almost laughed out loud when she overheard James on the intercom to his secretary. "As soon as she comes back from lunch, no, forget that. Tell Sue to report to my office immediately." Later that afternoon, Sue approached Deborah as she sat at her desk. "Do you have a moment, Deborah?" With all the shade she could summon, Deborah replied, "Why, of course, anything for you, Sue." Sue informed her that her request for time off from training for assistant counsel had been approved starting immediately, and that her time off request for her duties as a paralegal was approved for Thursday. She did not need to come into work on Friday. "There's something else. I've been instructed to tell you that if you need more than the requested 2 days off, you can consider that time already authorized and take as much time as you need to take care of your business, with pay. But, Deborah, you should know that when these inspections are over, you might want to take into consideration that the office won't need as much work from our paralegals anymore. Just something to think about, okay, hon?" Without waiting for a response, Sue turned and left. Deborah understood exactly what Sue was getting at, but she had more important things on her mind to deal with at that moment. It wasn't until later that evening, when she was home, having just finished packing for her trip to Jacksonville, that she was able to get Denise on the phone. It was the first time they'd spoken to one another in days, and they enjoyed the reunion. Denise repeated to her all the things that she had said in the voicemail, and also explained the reason why she wrote them down in a letter instead of calling and telling her immediately. Deborah said she understood and reassured Denise that it was a good idea. Denise was telling her about the letter and how she probably hadn't gotten it yet, but to be on the lookout for it any day. As Denise was explaining it all, Deborah heard a sound outside. It was the sound of a car door closing, but it wasn't just any car door. It was an instantly familiar sound that she'd heard many times years before. She knew the sound very well, in fact, and was puzzled to be hearing it again. Still listening to Denise on the phone, she got up off the couch, walked over to the living room window, pushed the shears aside, and looked out. Chapter 16. Travis Returns. When the letter that Denise wrote to Deborah arrived at the post office, as luck would have it, the letter happened to be sorted by Travis. It had been 2 years ago when he'd arrived at the office and found the letter of resignation that Deborah had left on his desk, that he began occupying his time by working extra hours at the post office. His original intention had been to spend more time at the office, hoping that they would get back together. But after finding that she'd quit, he kept putting in the extra hours to keep his mind off of his failed marriage, and so that his father didn't feel uncomfortable or crowded by him always being in the house. So staying at work turned out to be a good solution for a number of reasons. The months turned into years, with Travis continuing to put in extra hours sorting mail, keeping his mind off the devastation he felt at the loss of his family. He was a man who proudly maintained old-fashioned values, but finding himself a divorcee took a heavy toll on him because it was a contradiction of those same values. He did his best at first not to conflate the failure of his marriage with being the failure of him as a husband, and eventually came to feel a sense of justification in choosing to move out on Deborah. He felt it was the stress that Deborah was under because of Gary's mysterious behavior change that caused their marriage to fail. Despite him being the one who walked out, Travis still believed that it was he, not Deborah, who remained true to the values they once shared. Because he was still young, he had difficulty recognizing the part that he played in the breakup, and continued to hold out that maybe Deborah would come back to her senses and they would get back together. He'd gone back home 2 days after she moved out, while he was waiting for the divorce papers to be drawn, to try and reconcile with Deborah, but discovered that she and Gary had moved. This is how his father was able to convince him to follow through with signing the divorce papers to protect himself from what she must be planning. Because clearly she is planning something and doesn't want you to know where she's at. He had no choice but to see the logic in what his father was saying, and he signed the divorce papers when they arrived the next day. He regretted that he had no way to get in touch with her to tell her about it before he signed the papers. Still hoping to find and talk to her before she was served the papers and the divorce became final, he went to Gary's school, only to find that he had been withdrawn, but no information had been given on where to send his records. Travis checked back with the school every day for the next week, and finally, with no answer, he realized that he had no way of getting in touch with Deborah or Gary. Realizing that by now the papers had to have been served, he asked the lawyer to disclose the address where the papers were delivered. The lawyer explained to him that by law he could not divulge that information, especially to him, in case he used the information to cause her harm, implicating the law firm in a lawsuit that they had no chance of defeating. Faced with the finality that his marriage was over, he had no other choice except waiting to receive the final divorce decree from his father's lawyer. In the days that passed, he began regretting his decision to leave. In the months that followed, his choice caused him considerable pain, and he began to take responsibility for his failure in his marriage. He'd known that Deborah was an orphan with no real family other than Gary and himself, back when they were still married, and he came to realize that leaving like he did was more devastating to her than he allowed himself to consider at the time. He began sinking into depression. It was while putting in the therapeutic extra hours at work to stave off the growing feeling of depression that he finally came to recognize his part in the failure of his marriage, and also how he came to be the one to sort the letter mailed to Deborah from Denise. When he saw that it was a handwritten letter addressed to Deborah, the temptation to open the letter was great. Knowing that she had no family, he wanted to know who it was and why they were writing to her. The desire to open the letter fueled his imagination, causing him to believe that Deborah had a long-lost family that she was connecting with, which could make it even more difficult for her to take him back. In the end, it was because he knew the penalties for opening someone else's mail that Travis decided he was not willing to break the law to find out what their connection to Deborah was. But having the letter did provide him with the opportunity that he sought when he began putting in the extra hours, the chance to see her again and possibly repair the damage to their relationship. Because of the letter, he now knew where she lived, and it became his mission in life to see her again. He considered the fact that he was committing a violation of the post office's code of ethics by tracking her down using the letter, but decided to go for it anyway. While he wasn't willing to break the law by opening the letter, he was willing to forego the ethics involved, because if it meant a chance of getting his family back together again, he was willing to take it, even if it meant losing his job. Standing there holding the letter, with his heart racing and his imagination running out of control, Travis took a moment to settle down and think clearly about what he wanted to do. As he did, he realized that he had no real idea of what he was planning. It had been years now since he had last seen Gary and Deborah. Even if it were not a long-lost family member writing the letter to her, he thought, she most likely would have found someone else by now. He then recognized that this wasn't only about her, it was also for him. What he really needed was closure. After all, she knows where I work, but she never reached out to get in touch with me, he thought. As he kept thinking about the situation, he began to come up with a more sensible plan. As supervisor, he was able to give himself any day off that he wanted, and he chose to take the next day off. Taking the letter home with him, he put the first step of his plan into action. His plan was to go visit Deborah the next day, under the guise of delivering the letter. He decided to go at 9 in the morning, when the mail was normally delivered to that address. He woke up in the morning at his usual time and realized that she would probably be at work at that time in the morning, but there was still a chance, albeit slim, that she might be at home. Paul was always up at the crack of dawn, so he and Travis often had breakfast together. As they ate, Travis considered telling his father about Deborah and the letter, but just as quickly dismissed the idea. There was no reason to expect that his father had any change of feelings about Deborah, unless it was for the worst. He left his father at the table reading the paper like he did every morning, only instead of going to work this morning, he was driving to the address on the letter. The trip to Deborah's address went by quickly because he was only thinking about what to do when he got there. When he arrived, got out of his car, walked up the walkway, and then knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time, and waited. No one was home. He was relieved that no one answered the door, because it dawned on him that he didn't know what he was going to say if she answered. It caught him off guard, realizing that he had skipped over that part in his planning. Now he began to second-guess the whole idea to hand-deliver the letter, thinking that his job was indeed not worth taking the risk. He quickly hurried down the walkway back to his car, worried that he might be seen by someone, got in, backed out, and left. Because his mind was consumed by the thoughts of his poorly thought-out plan, it didn't occur to him to leave the letter in the mailbox. But if he had remembered to do it, he would have, and been done with the whole thing. His attitude changed again as he was leaving. I'm letting go of this pipe dream of reconnecting with someone that doesn't want to reconnect with me, he thought. Now he had a little pep to his step, feeling invigorated. It's my day off, he thought, and I'm going to enjoy it as he drove back home. His father was on his way out the door when he came in. I've got an appointment at the doctor's today, son. I wish you'd let me know you were going to be home. I could have changed it. It was a last-minute thing, Pop, but go ahead to your appointment. I'll be here when you get back. Happy to at last have some time alone, and even though it was 10 in the morning, he poured himself a tall glass of whiskey with no chaser and played the music loud. He danced the morning away in his living room, and it wasn't until he found out that he'd run out of whiskey that he finally stopped. He looked at the time. It was almost 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He had expected his father to have returned home by now. Concerned, he called him and found that everything was fine. Paul decided to take in a movie after his doctor's appointment. Turns out it was a double feature, so he was enjoying himself. Travis wanted to enjoy himself too and decided to head to the gym. I'm going to work out and maybe meet someone, he thought, the alcohol giving him courage and helping him to forget about Deborah. When he got into his car, he saw the undelivered letter on the passenger seat, reminding him of how he was feeling earlier that morning. Cursing himself for being a romantic fool in the first place, he got in, started his car, and made his way to the gym. He worked out for 2 hours, the first hour spent trying to get the attention of the few women there. Finding no luck with that, he spent the next hour working out with a vengeance because the few women that were there didn't notice him at all. The last hour found him sobering up, the workout taking his mind off of everything from earlier that day. When he finished, he showered, the water on his face chasing away any remnants of his intoxication, leaving him feeling refreshed. He dressed and went out to the car. He opened the door, having forgotten again about the letter in the front seat, so it surprised him upon seeing it. The earlier alcohol-induced feeling of freedom and elation was gone now. He sat in the car staring at the letter. Now angry at himself, he decided to deliver the letter once and for all. With a purposeful twist of his wrist, he violently turned the key in the ignition, hurting his finger and cursing under his breath as he backed out of the parking space. He pointed his car in the direction of Deborah's apartment, stomped on the accelerator, and took off, tires screeching and driving as if he were still drunk. He arrived an hour later, at 6 in the evening. As he pulled up, he could see the lights on in the apartment and knew that she was home. He became nervous. Up until that point, it had been a perfectly made plan, one that centered around him having a better life without her, and her wishing he would take her back. But now, as he was about to come face to face with his ex-wife for the first time in 2 years, the woman that, while sitting in the car, he finally admitted to himself he was still in love with, he realized now that he really had no plan. He parked his car and thought again about just backing out and leaving. But then he just sat there, not even getting out while his mind swirled with ideas. He shook his head and came to his senses, and then, mad at himself, he quickly got out before he changed his mind and slammed the car door. He caught himself as he did it, because he hadn't intended to slam the door, but it was already too late, and the sound carried across the parking lot to the apartments. Shrugging it off, he started walking up the walkway to her apartment door. He noticed that with the lights on in the apartment, he could see in through the living room window, and that she was on the telephone. Probably with her boyfriend, he sullenly mused. He was still walking, even while his mind was screaming at him to just turn around. He took control of his thoughts, and he let the images he'd made up of his reunion with Deborah surface in his mind. For a moment it worked, but then they were stamped out because those images did not include her answering the door while she was on the phone with her boyfriend. The last thought brought him back from his crushing daydream, and he suddenly decided that he was not going to go through with this after all. But none of that really mattered now. It was already too late. During the time he was waffling about what he was going to do, Deborah had been approaching her front door from the living room, and just as he stopped to turn around and leave, she opened the door and stood there looking at him, phone still to her ear. He stood there busted, caught, frozen like a deer in headlights, and then he clumsily began fumbling through his jacket pockets to produce the letter. His voice was stuck in his throat as he tried to talk. It came out like a creaking sound. He cleared his throat and then tried to talk again, only then his voice cracked and the words came out sounding squeaky. This came for you. I'm just dropping it off." She stood there unmoving, immobilized, with a look of surprise on her face, still holding the phone to her ear, not looking at the letter, but looking at him. Bewildered, he thrust the letter forward, hiding behind it, using it to break their eye contact. Then he heard her calmly talk to whomever it was on the other end of the phone. "Denise, I'm going to call you back in just..." Deborah's shock had been interrupted by the letter that he put in front of her face, and her eyes focused on the letter. Then she fainted. Chapter 17. The Gang's All Here. Gary felt the unfamiliar sensation of the blood running cold in his body. He was unable to move or speak. As he looked at his mother and Travis standing in the office, his mind went completely blank. Feeling numb all over as if he were dreaming, he heard a weird sound, something between joy and anguish coming from his mother as she ran up to him and took him in her arms. While being held, his rubbery legs started to give out. He saw the man that had once been his stepfather standing in the office, holding on to the desk for balance. His face only registered shock as he stood there staring at Gary. Then, as if in slow motion, everything started spinning. Gary felt outside of his body as if he were floating, and then amusingly thought to himself, "Why am I laying on my back going round and round on this carousel?" The very last thing he remembered seeing was Carl pulling out his phone. He slowly came to, lying on the couch in the office. He could hear people talking, some voices familiar. Then, as his vision focused, he saw Travis and Carl talking to one another. Seeing the two together was the absolute last thing he imagined he would ever see. He wondered if he were dreaming. Near them was Thelma, his mother and the tutor. He couldn't remember her name, but he was struck by the familiar way she was holding his mother's hand as the three women talked. As his gaze continued across the room, his eyes met Tony's. "Hey, y'all! Gary's awake!" Everyone turned and looked at him, and for a few seconds they all just stared. Gary, using his elbows, tried to rise from the lying position on the couch, but struggled, slow to regain his balance. Tony rushed to him, helping him to the sitting position. "What's happening?" Gary asked, confused. His constricted throat only allowed his voice to let out a croaking sound. As he sat up and noticed all eyes on him, it caused him to have a momentary flashback. Emotionally, he flashed back to his feelings associated with the popularity of his younger years that he had grown to despise. But the conscious memory it triggered was the memory of the first time he saw Denise at the party, when they were 12 years old, in a room full of people, all looking at him, where all he saw were her eyes. Now again, in a room full of people, all looking at him, that moment in time was repeating itself. He looked back at all the people in the room, his eyes coming to focus on Denise looking at him. Now he was able to see what he failed to see before, and that the familiarity he felt when he first saw her outside the apartment was because it was Denise. His heart began to swell, and he smiled at her, reaching for her, the sound of his voice almost like pleading. "Denise?" The look on his face said it all. He was still undeniably in love with her, and as they looked at one another, a single thought repeated over and over in her astonished mind. "I knew it! I knew that was my Gary! I knew it! I knew it!" Then she turned to look at Deborah, whose trembling grip on Denise's hand was now crushing. The look on his mother's face had gone completely blank as she stared at him, unable to speak, and then she started to swoon. Travis quickly came up behind her, putting his arms around her and pulling her close, keeping her from losing her footing and collapsing. He could feel every emotion she was experiencing in that moment. Other than Gary having said Denise, the entire room, and even the birds outside, were silent. Tony, the only one in the room who had no idea of what was actually happening, broke the silence. "Oh, so now you want to talk to her?" The room erupted in laughter. Even Deborah started laughing, wiping away the tear from beneath her eye. Gary, having regained his senses, sat completely up and swung his legs off the couch, but remained seated. He was now looking at his mother, who came up and sat beside him, putting her arm around his shoulder. Tony backed away, making room for Denise, as she came up to the other side of Gary on the couch and sat next to him. Travis followed, coming to stand next to Deborah, putting one hand on her shoulder, again feeling her emotions at the time, and smiling broadly, looking both at her and Gary. "Now, what's this I hear about you being an orphan, Gary Edwards?" He stiffened up at first, then as the words of the question registered in his mind, he let out a loud, uncontrollable laugh, which then immediately turned into stifled laughter, while bending his head down and raising one arm as if to say, "I'm guilty." Then everyone burst into laughter as well. Soon the laughter died down. "Okay, we still have a business to run here. Tony, let's get back at it," Carl said. "You got it, boss." "Denise, let's—" Carl stopped as Thelma put her hand on his shoulder. "You just take your time. Gary, take the day off, and y'all stay as long as you want to, but the rest of us got to get back to work. Groceries won't sell themselves." Thelma came up, bent over, and embraced Gary and Deborah as they sat on the couch. "The Lord sure does work in mysterious ways," she whispered as she hugged them. Then she straightened up and started escorting Carl out of the office, who was still talking, looking back over his shoulder and pointing to Gary. "I knew you was a good kid when I first met you. I was just telling Thelma." His voice cut off as Thelma pulled the door closed behind them. Taking her hand, Gary looked at Denise, then turned to his mother. "How did you find her? How did—" Denise interrupted him by pulling her hand away from his as she stood up. "Why did you break up with me, Gary? Tell me that. Everything was going so well, and I was falling in love with you." "It was too much, Denise. Everyone was expecting me to be something I was not, and then you too. It was just too much." Deborah, Travis, and Denise immediately wore the same look of confusion at what Gary was saying. "What do you mean, Gary?" Deborah asked. "Mom, I never wanted to be in the spelling bee, but after I kept winning, no one would listen to me anymore. I was just doing what everyone expected me to do, even you and Dad." There was a brief silence after he spoke, and then Gary turned to face Denise. He reached for her hand and pulled her back to sitting on the couch next to him, this time holding her hand tightly. "I never wanted to break up with you, Denise. I was young then. Still, I always thought we would be together for the rest of our lives. But then I thought you only wanted to be with me because I was popular. I began to hate myself for ever letting it get that far. That's why I turned away from everyone and ran away. I hated being popular when I didn't want it in the first place." By now, he was on the verge of tears. The atmosphere of joy in the room had become solemn. It was Travis who spoke next. "Gary, it's okay, son. You're going to be fine, and I'll tell you how I know. You are a young man who has already learned an important lesson in life, one that I only recently learned after it was too late, after I lost you and your mom. You learned how to speak up for yourself, Gary, and to stand by your choice no matter what the cost. If I had that courage before, none of this would have ever happened." Travis stopped speaking, but the room was silent. Everyone was still and staring at Travis. Suddenly he realized that he had to continue explaining. "You see, when you were hurting and no one could explain your behavior, I knew what you were going through. Not the specifics, but I knew what you were feeling. It was the same thing for me when I was your age. But instead of telling your mother, instead of being your father, I chose to keep my mouth closed and watch the stress of it take a toll on your mother. I didn't want to run the risk of getting your mother angry at me for interfering and telling her to just let you come around in your own time. One thing led to another, and the stress came out of all of us." "No, Travis, it wasn't just your fault," Deborah interrupted. "You were right. I would have taken it out on you. I did think I knew everything that was best for my son, because I thought I knew everything. I thought I was strong and tough and smart, but in reality, I was just afraid. It was only after Denise and I met that I learned I didn't even know myself." Now the room was quiet again. This time, all eyes were on Deborah. "After you were gone and Gary ran away, I fell into depression, but didn't even realize it until after I met Denise at the shelter where I started working after I resigned from the post office. She told me about her mother, and I recognized that I was just like her, except that I was determined to be who I wanted to be instead of who I am. I was depressed and lost until I came to accept who I am. I had to face the fact that I wasn't strong and tough, because in reality, I was depressed and needed help. The more Denise and I talked, the clearer I came to see myself. So, no, Travis, it wasn't your fault. It was mine." Travis put his hands on both of Deborah's shoulders and pulled, urging her up from sitting on the couch to standing in front of him, and then he took her in his arms, both of them sobbing into one another's strong embrace. Denise, watching them, was overcome with happiness for Deborah, and then let out a whimper before she herself burst into tears of joy, covering her face while sobbing, and burying her head into Gary's lap as they sat together on the couch. Gary, his body convulsing as he held back from crying, stroked Denise's hair in his lap, while silent tears ran down both of his cheeks. Chapter 18. Reunited. For the rest of the day, with Gary off from work and Denise not attending classes, the two couples reconnected with one another and built bonds stronger than they ever shared before. As evening began to fall, it was Deborah who reminded Gary and Denise that he had to go to work and she had to attend classes the next day. Gary and Denise both agreed and left to go back to Gary's apartment. They took a taxi there, expecting to find Tony where they would be able to fill him in on the whole story about their past, but they found a note from him instead. It read, "Hey, Gary and Niecy, Carl filled me in on what happened. I still can't believe it. But the apartment is yours. I will see you at work when you get back. Tony." The next day, it was Thelma who took time away from the store to show Deborah and Travis around the highlights in the city of Jacksonville. When Gary got off work and Denise finished her classes, they joined his parents, who had returned to the Robinson mansion for dinner. During the meal, Deborah and Travis announced the date they were to be remarried. Carl and Thelma, who had now become so involved with Travis and Deborah, as well as Gary and Denise's reunion, and the whole unbelievable turn of events that they witnessed take place and having played a vital part in, made an agreement with Deborah and Travis to cover all the expenses for their wedding, under the condition that they return to Jacksonville to get remarried, so that all of the Robinson family could attend. Deborah took Travis off to the side and explained to him how Thelma's offer stirred something in her that she never imagined she would feel. She began to feel like she had found her long-lost family. He said that he understood how she felt because he was having the same feelings. In the past, Deborah in particular would have kept those kinds of thoughts to herself to escape the vulnerability that comes with sharing feelings. But as part of the process of bonding with one another like they never did before, she'd explain how she was feeling to him. Then the happy couple let Carl and Thelma know that they were honored to accept. When the time came for Deborah and Travis to return to Philly, Gary, encouraged by earlier conversations with his mother, agreed to remain in Jacksonville, where he was now close to getting his GED, and so that he could stay close to Denise. Deborah had come to feel very protective of Denise, who, as it turned out, despite learning about her many relatives, also had to be encouraged to stay enrolled in college and not to return once again to live with Deborah in Philly. Chapter 19. Back home in Philly. Deborah and Travis returned to Philadelphia and wasted no time restructuring their individual lives towards becoming one again. They both agreed that Travis would move out of his old room at home with his father and into Deborah's apartment. When Travis spoke with his father about moving out, Paul lashed out at him. "You must be a fool. I thought I raised you better than to let this woman back into your life to take advantage of you." Paul had raised his son the best he could, but he was unable to teach him about love and forgiveness when he had yet to learn about it himself. The way that Teresa, his wife, and Travis's mother abandoned both he and Travis had left him with deep emotional scars. But now Travis was finally able to see in his father what he'd failed to see before, that all along he had been giving him advice that was following an agenda designed to prevent him from allowing Deborah back into his life. After realizing this, he still maintained respect for his father, Nothing would ever change that. But now aware of how deeply that he disliked Deborah, he decided to no longer blindly follow his father's advice as he had done in the past, without first considering it for himself, and whenever possible, Deborah's opinion as well. Because of his father's outburst, Travis waited a few days for his father to cool off before inviting him to his and Deborah's wedding, scheduled to take place in 2 months. He was not surprised when Paul angrily protested and said there was no way he would be attending their wedding. Unable to talk to him when he was angry, Travis only hoped his father would reconsider. After returning to work at the law office, and with the inspections completed, Deborah's work schedule had been changed, and her hours as a paralegal were reduced to only 10 hours a week, as Sue promised she would do. What would have been a disastrous turn of events if Deborah's life was the same as before she left, was now a blessing, giving her more time to reconnect with Travis and to devote more of her time to completing the training and testing for assistant counsel to the firm. 2 weeks later, after she completed the course and earned her associate's degree in criminal justice, Deborah was rehired at Prentice and Van Meyer as assistant counsel. At James's suggestion during the firm's weekly meeting, she was assigned a collateral duty in the office as human resources manager. 2 days later, to no one's surprise, Sue resigned her position. An ad appeared in the local classifieds seeking an experienced office manager for the firm, and the position was filled the very next day. After her second week of performing the duties of assistant counsel with the firm, one of which was to, each week, collect cases from the courts that the judges assigned to the various lawyers at Prentice and Van Meyer who served as public defenders, Deborah recognized the name on one of the files. It was the same name as Denise's mother, Carol Robinson. Deborah had aced the ethics portion of her test for assistant counsel, so she knew better than to try and contact Carol without going through the proper channels. She arrived at the office and consulted with James as to whether it was permissible for her to make direct contact with any of the people in the case files. James told her that it was permissible for the firm's assistant counsel to contact anyone in the case files, and she was even encouraged to do so, because by law, no lawyers at the firm were allowed to before being taken on as counsel. Now, curious, James asked what her interest was in the case file. Deborah explained the possibility of the person in the case being Denise's mother. By this time, because of her testimony at the church and his intervention that enabled her to go to Jacksonville, James felt a personal involvement in the ongoing saga of her life, and jumped at the chance to include himself and have a more personal part in her story. He offered to accompany Deborah as she conducted the intake interview with Carol, expressing that if things went well, that he would take her case instead of one of the public defenders employed at the firm. They arrived at the jail and met with Carol. Deborah conducted the interview, advising her that because of her numerous prior arrests for the same crime, she might very well be looking at an extended prison sentence. Desperate and still trying to find some way out of her situation, Carol tried dropping her mother's name in the hopes that her reputation as a lawyer might somehow still be able to help Carol to get a lesser sentence. Deborah, hearing her say the name Kathy Robinson, confirmed for her that this was definitely Denise's mother. Deborah sat back and closed her file. She looked directly at Carol and asked if she had a daughter named Denise. Instantly suspicious, she questioned Deborah. "Who are you? Why do you want to know about my daughter? Is she here? Where's my daughter?" "Calm down. Just answer the question," James said. James had taken up a position leaning against the wall, far away from the table where Deborah was conducting the interview. If they were being filmed, though unlikely, he was demonstrating that he had no contact with the potential client before she agreed to representation by the firm. "Don't tell me to calm down. Who the hell are you anyway? Where's my daughter?" Deborah gave her just a brief answer about how she met Denise at the shelter and arranged to help her. Suddenly, Carol jumped up out of the chair. James had to quickly step forward to restrain her as she tried to reach out to grab Deborah across the table. James pulled her back and down into her seat. From across the table she yelled, demanding that Deborah tell her what had become of her daughter. Deborah had already gotten out of her seat and backed away from Carol before she had a chance to grab her. Deborah had not expected Carol to be this concerned about her daughter, not after the way Denise described how she treated her. But Deborah could tell that this was for real. Carol wasn't trying to use her daughter to find another way out of her situation. When Deborah first met Denise at the shelter and they started talking, she told Deborah about her mother. Deborah felt like Denise was talking about her, what she would have been like if she never had Gary and decided to change her life, or what she would have been like if she had a family, someone else who could have taken care of Gary. She knew that she never would have changed. She had enjoyed being angry too much, and at the time, it was the only thing that she could truly call her own. Now, face to face with Carol, she understood everything that she was going through, except why she now seemed to care about Denise. Deborah calmly told her that they had to complete the intake interview before she could go into any further details. With that said, Carol got control of herself and calmed down. James backed away, but remained close. Deborah returned to her seat, opened the folder, and continued asking the required questions. With the intake completed, James then came up and introduced himself. Then he told Carol that he knew her mother before she died. Deborah, surprised, stopped writing, but never looked up. Instead, she only listened. "Your mother was and still is an inspiration to me and all of the lawyers at my firm." Carol turned around to see him slowly walking away, taking one slow step at a time as he spoke. After talking about Carol's mother, he told her how he came to meet her daughter at church. Now, as he continued speaking, he turned around, walking towards Carol just as slowly as before. Deborah had given up acting as if she were writing and sat back in her seat after he mentioned Denise at church. He walked over to where Carol sat at the table and stood close to her. Then he bent over to look her in the eye. "Look at you. You're a disgrace to your mother's reputation. I can't believe you had the nerve to even speak her name." Then he straightened up and turned, joining Deborah on the other side of the table. Carol sat stunned. No one had ever spoken to her this way, or had ever been able to make her feel this way before. Deborah looked at James with surprise, never before seeing this side of him. He was not the same kind and considerate man that hired her, not when he talked to Carol. He took a seat next to her, across the table from Carol. The room remained quiet until he spoke to her again. This time his tone was softer. He said that he would be willing to take her case before the judge, out of respect for her mother. "But before I take your case, you will tell me everything that led up to your arrest, starting with everything that happened after you threw your own teenage daughter out of the house and into the streets of this city." Chapter 20. The Turning Point. The balance of the chip that Carol carried on her shoulder for years had already begun tipping weeks before she was confronted by James. She'd regretted putting her daughter out as soon as her high wore off later that night, after realizing what she had done and that Denise was really gone. But it was in having to account for her behavior That was the final straw that brought her to the point of surrender. With nowhere left to turn, and facing years in prison, she was in tears as she admitted her wrongdoings to James and Deborah in that meeting room. She came clean about the reasons for her years of abuse to Denise and to her mother. There was an element of poetic justice to it all, something that no one could have ever seen coming, revealed by Carol in the fact that her arrest came as a result of her trying to buy drugs from an undercover cop. She had already used up all of her opportunities to buy from her usual dealers, who were unwilling to sell to her anymore for her own good, worried that she might overdose. She confessed that she was using more than she normally did because she was trying to dull the pain that she caused herself by putting her daughter out. Her heartfelt confession had an effect not only on Deborah, who was already sympathetic towards her, but on James, too, who had already judged her before he met her based on what he learned from Denise when she testified at church. Now, moved by the pain he saw that she was living with, he thought about her mother and then became determined to help Carol. After the meeting, he and Deborah left the jail and returned to the firm to begin working on her case. As Deborah sat down at her desk, she immediately considered calling Denise to tell her about the events involving Carol, but then realized that it would be a bad idea if Carol ended up serving time. The less Denise knew about it in that event, the better off she would be. So Deborah decided to keep the news to herself until she felt it was safe to tell Denise. While she was mulling over making the call, James approached with Carol's file in hand. Deborah looked up at him, and he started by telling her that he knew the judge who was presiding over the case and that he was owed a favor by him. He then said that despite her record, he was sure he could get Carol a suspended sentence under the condition that she enroll in a drug rehab clinic. While he was talking to her, Deborah remembered the way that his entire personality changed when he was talking to Carol. Almost as if he could read her mind, the conversation shifted while he continued looking at her file. She really needs a break in life. I am going to recommend she be enrolled in the facility that we have under contract and that the firm pick up the tab for her treatment. What do you think? Deborah looked at him confused, trying to understand him. He'd made it crystal clear that he didn't think much of her. She was still trying to understand where he stood, so she never answered his question. The pause gave him time to think. I knew her mother. She was an incredible lawyer and an incredible woman. The least I can do is take care of her daughter. Then he turned and walked back to his office, closing the door behind him. With this, Deborah's tense shoulders relaxed, and she sat back into her chair. Her recent suspicion about how cold-hearted he really was behind his smile disappeared. She again considered calling Denise with the good news about her mother's case, but as she reached for the phone, she hesitated and then opened the intercom to James's office. She asked him if she could call Denise and tell her. He suggested that she hold off making the call until after the case was settled in court, because you never know for sure until after the case is settled. The next day, Deborah returned to the jail and briefed Carol about the process that she would be involved in, and that she was going to have to be willing to attend drug rehab after court. She heard this same offer so many times that she knew the speech by heart and agreed to the terms. She kept it to herself, but this time, unlike in the past, she was going to take full advantage of the treatment program. It was her first step in turning her life around, having already decided to do so, no matter what the outcome of her case in court would be. The day came when she was to appear in court. She found both James and Deborah already in the courtroom when she was brought in from the jail. When her case was called, she was brought up and seated at the table next to them. The judge looked at her, and then at James. The communication between the two only lasted for a fraction of a second. "Miss Robinson, I see you are being represented by the firm of Prentice and Van Meyer. At least you have that going for you." The judge read her charges, then also read aloud her entire rap sheet. It took 5 minutes. Then he ruled just as James had predicted, with one exception. Judge Thomas Brown and James enjoyed a long-lasting friendship that included Kathy Robinson when she was alive. They'd shared more dinners and bottles of wine together than he could remember. He did not understand what Carol had on him to make him call in his favor, nor did he believe James when he told him it was out of respect for Kathy. But he could look out for his friend and see to it that whatever hold she had on him, she would not be able to use it. Carol was ordered to an inpatient drug rehab program, but because of the number of her repeated drug violations in the past, if she successfully completed the drug rehab program, she is then ordered to leave the city of Philadelphia, never to return. Violating this ban would result in her immediate arrest, and she would then serve a mandatory 10-year prison sentence with no possibility of early release or parole. When asked if she had anything that she wanted to say, Carol apologized to the court for her past infractions and promised the judge that she would never return to her previous life of drug use and crime again. After listening to her, he glared at her from the bench. "I knew your mother, young lady, and if you truly want to change, then think about her memory whenever you feel like things are too difficult for you to continue without turning to drugs, because this is your very last chance to stay out of prison." "Yes, I understand, Your Honor," Carol answered. The judge then announced the case closed. Carol thanked the court and was then escorted back to her cell. Later that day, she was transferred to the drug rehab facility to begin her inpatient treatment. She was surprised that she had no further contact with either Deborah or James before she was admitted. She was never told how long she was to remain at the facility, nor did she ask. Carol was determined to go through with the treatment, no matter how long it took. Chapter 21. Leaving Philadelphia. A month had passed, and as she neared the completion of the treatment program, Carol met with Deborah and learned about the plan they'd come up with concerning her having to leave Philly once she completed the program. Deborah explained how they wanted to tell her earlier, but decided to wait until she'd proven that she would actually follow through with her commitment to complete the program. They planned on taking her back with them to her hometown in Jacksonville, where they were going to be married, and where she could reunite with her daughter and her family. But Carol immediately refused. She said that the reason her mother left Jacksonville after her father died was because of her behavior as a teen. She felt that everybody back home blamed her for her father's death, and it was how she mistreated Denise as a baby that finally convinced her mother to move to Philadelphia so that her father's family name did not have to be dragged down by the things she was doing. She was sure that she was not welcome back in Jacksonville, so she refused, telling Deborah that she would rather go somewhere else because she wasn't ready to deal with her family and couldn't face her daughter after all the bad things she'd done to her over the years. With just a week before she graduated the program, Deborah was sure that she could convince Carol to change her mind, and they had many hours-long conversations together during that week. The first long conversation was about Deborah's past, about how she had to overcome the guilt and shame that she felt because of the things that she did in her past. Before she was able to change, she had to own up to what she had done and accept that she was the one who had done it, instead of running away from a past that she could never escape from. "It wasn't easy," Deborah said, "but that's what I had to do before I could begin to change my life." Carol stayed honest with her and told her that she understood what she had to do, but she didn't think she could do it, not around her family and her daughter. It was during their conversation the next day, after Deborah told her about the things that led up to her getting divorced from Travis, things that happened after she'd already made the changes in her life, but leaving out the part that Denise played in helping her to finally change. But these were the words that finally got through to Carol. Because Deborah and Travis had divorced and were now getting remarried, Carol was able to see the living proof of what Deborah was telling her, and was then able to trust that Deborah probably knew what was best for her after all. She had slowly come to the realization that she had to start somewhere, and the sooner the better, so she may as well start now. Carol agreed to accompany Deborah and Travis to attend their wedding in Jacksonville, but specified that it was only for the wedding, leaving herself a way of justifying why she had to leave in case meeting with her family or Denise didn't go well. Despite feeling that she was not ready to take that step, she nonetheless agreed to face her daughter and family to begin taking the long journey that Deborah talked about, to make amends for all of her past behaviors. Another outcome from the week of intense conversations was that the two women became very close, closer than most sisters. They talked about every aspect of their lives. The only information that Deborah withheld talking about with Carol was her relationship with Denise. She realized that it would serve no purpose for Carol to learn how close she and Denise had become, especially since it was almost assured that Carol's feelings of jealousy would create a wedge between them. Later that afternoon, as she was driving home, Deborah called and was finally able to tell Denise about meeting her mother. Denise sounded surprised, but Deborah could hear in her voice that she was far from happy about the news. Deborah asked if she wanted to talk about it, but Denise had already shut down and told her that she needed time to think about it. Then they hung up. But Deborah remained determined to reconnect Carol with her daughter and Denise with her mother. She was just as determined now as she was to connect Denise with her family, no matter what, because she knew, like only someone who has no family knows, what the real value of staying connected with family holds. Chapter 22. In Jacksonville. Travis, Deborah, and Carol arrived in Jacksonville, but not really knowing what to expect from the rest of the Robinson family concerning Carol. Before they left Philly, and all during the flight, she had emphasized that she was likely not going to be welcomed by the family, and repeatedly asked Travis to make sure to reserve a separate room at the hotel for her too, just to be on the safe side. They were met at the airport by Gary, Denise, Thelma, and Carl, who were happy to see them in anticipation of the upcoming wedding, but also surprised and excited to see Carol. As was his normal way, Carl was especially loud and boisterous as he greeted the trio in the airport, his happy voice carried, echoing in every direction. Carl's over-the-top behavior was comical and calculated, serving to ease the stress off of both Carol and Denise as they were reuniting for the first time since Carol put her out of their home 2 years ago. Deborah, when introducing Carol to Thelma and Carl, was immediately silenced by Thelma. "Come here, child. Lord, let me get a look at you. Thelma said, pushing past Carl while coming forward to hug Carol tightly, while warmly welcoming her back to Jacksonville and back into the Robinson family fold. After the embrace, Carl and Thelma told Carol that they knew her mother and father very well and had known her since she was just a baby, and they were so happy to see her again, now all grown up. After a few moments, Deborah then introduced Carol to Gary. Carol then realized that she knew of Gary, but had never actually met him before. She knew of him because she remembered Denise saying his name many times in the past. She felt a twinge of guilt remembering that this boy was the reason behind why her resentment for Denise increased. His being in Denise's life triggered her jealousy, reminding her of the love she held years ago for Trey, Denise's father, who left her shortly after finding out that she was pregnant. Time and drug use had an effect on Carol's memory of what really happened between her and Trey, but it meant little because the result was the same. She hugged Gary and with all sincerity hoped that whatever negative feelings he may have felt for her would be changed in time as they got to know one another better. Then she came and stood before Denise. It had only been 2 years since they'd last seen one another. For Denise, it seemed like only a few weeks. For Carol, a decade. She missed her daughter very, very much, but the guilt that flooded her mind in that instant proved to be too much for her to overcome. She stood before her daughter unmoving. Denise had no idea how she was going to feel when she saw her mother for the first time in years. But when she did lay eyes on her, she was so overcome with happiness at seeing her mother that she took her into her arms and hugged her tightly. Carol's arms slowly came up to embrace her daughter, and the longer they hugged, the tighter her grip on Denise became. They hugged for so long that Carl began gathering everyone up, ushering them towards the airport skyway, laughing, "Come on now, y'all, we got to go." He eventually had to pull them apart when it became clear that neither of them were going to stop holding on to one another. As the group made its way off the skyway and to the parking garage, Denise stayed by her mother's side, not letting go of her hand even once. Not as they left the airport, nor as they rode together to the hotel. Neither Deborah, Gary, Carl, Thelma, or even Carol had ever seen Denise so animated before. She was excitedly talking nonstop to Carol. Deborah was so thrilled for both of them, feeling as if her plans for Denise and Carol were coming together perfectly. But then she noticed that Carol, unlike Denise, was much, much more reserved and only spoke after repeated urging by Denise for an answer to her question. Also recognizing Carol's lack of enthusiasm, Carl and Thelma in the front seat of the Escalade exchanged knowing and worried glances with one another. The trip to the hotel went by with everyone listening to Denise telling her mother what she had learned about their family history. When they arrived at the hotel, before everyone started getting out of the car, Carl reminded Gary that he still had to be to work in the morning. Gary decided to join Travis and his mother in their hotel room, leaving Denise to be alone with her mother. Carl and Thelma then left for home. As they sat together in their hotel room, Denise and Carol caught up with what happened in each other's lives over the past 2 years. Denise did most of the talking, and at no time did she ever think about the problems that they had in the past as mother and daughter. The same, however, could not be said for Carol. When her turn came to speak, she began by tearfully apologizing, and no matter how many times Denise assured her that she viewed what happened between them as water under the bridge and that everything was okay, Carol continued dwelling on the past, telling Denise that she understood if she hated her. Denise slowly began to recognize the courage that it took for Carol just to see and meet with her, instead of trying to escape the situation that she was dealing with. But Denise was also overcome and heartbroken by the vulnerability that she now saw in her mother, trying so desperately to relate with her despite her enormous feelings of guilt. Denise also knew that she had to work through those feelings of pity that she felt for her mother, and to keep up a good front and a happy face. She knew better than to let those feelings show, because if she did, it would only add to the problem, and her mother might never recover from the guilt that she was feeling. It was during their conversation that Denise privately decided that she was going to take care of her mother, to help her get through these issues, no matter what she had to do or how long it might take to do it. It was after she had this thought that she suddenly knew exactly what she wanted to major in at school. She decided to study to be a psychiatrist. After seeing the pain that her mother was going through, she tried to guess how many years it would take for her mother to get over her guilt, determined that she was going to be the one to help her mother get through it. Carl and Thelma were major stockholders in the hotel, and unknown to Carol, Deborah, or Travis, had arranged with the general manager to reserve all of the rooms on the floor where Carol and their rooms were for the entire weekend. The next morning, after Gary and Denise had already left for work and school, other members of the Robinson family began to arrive at the hotel looking to see Carol. It became a true homecoming celebration that ended up lasting for the next 2 days. Every member of the Robinson family living in and around Jacksonville came through at some point during the 2 days to meet Carol and to join in the early celebration of the upcoming wedding. Some members of the family were meeting Carol for the first time, but even those who knew what she used to be like all welcomed her as if none of her past behaviors had ever happened. Carol's feelings of guilt towards her family only centered around her letting them down, and so weren't nearly as crippling as was the pain she felt and couldn't get over after what she'd done to Denise. She quickly came to see that her fears about being unwelcome were unfounded and imagined. She did come to see that she needed her family, and they also needed her. During that evening, she sought out Deborah amidst the crowd of her family and pulled her aside to thank her for urging her to reunite with her family. They tearfully embraced one another when Deborah shared with her how much it meant, because she didn't have the extended family to reunite with, and now she knew what it felt like through the deep connection that she shared with Carol. As Thursday afternoon turned into evening, Carl and Thelma returned with Gary and Denise, and everyone still visiting was invited to attend a celebration of family dinner being held in the hotel restaurant. Everyone enjoyed a gracious buffet and eventually made their way back upstairs to the hotel rooms where the socializing was in full swing. Remaining behind at the table with Deborah and Travis, Carl and Thelma began going over the itinerary that she'd created to prepare for the wedding taking place the day after tomorrow. Deborah thought of Carol, then excused herself, promising to return very soon. She went up to their floor and sought out Carol. Finding her in her room, surrounded by family, she asked if Carol would be interested in joining them tomorrow as they followed Thelma's itinerary. Carol thanked her but declined. The next morning found Gary at work, Denise at school, Deborah and Travis out following their wedding itinerary, and all of the visiting members of her family gone. Carol was finally able to have some time alone in her room. She began trying to figure out what her plans were. She knew that she could not return to Philadelphia after the wedding, and while she was certain that she would be provided for by a member of her huge family, no one had actually discussed with her any plans for where she would be living. Her first step, with the lessons for living a drug-free life still fresh in her mind, was to seek out the local NA, Narcotics Anonymous chapter, to find a sponsor. She called the phone number that she found in the phone book and was surprised when, after just a brief conversation, she was told to be on the lookout for a visit from a woman named Greta Schmidt, who would take her to the nearest NA group. When Greta arrived in the hotel lobby, Carol immediately recognized her. She was an older woman with a carefree demeanor, dressed somewhat like a hippie. Carol approached and greeted her. It was still morning, so they made themselves a cup of coffee and sat in the lobby making their introductions. They had only spoken briefly, but both could tell right off the bat that they shared a connection, already feeling as if they were old friends. Greta soon suggested that they go someplace more casual, where they could talk more freely. The two women left the hotel lobby and went to Greta's car. All the while, Carol was filling her in on how she came to be in Jacksonville. Greta continued to listen to Carol as she drove to a nearby diner, where they stopped for an early lunch, with Carol continuing to tell her about the events that brought them together. Greta listened, fascinated by the entire story. When she finished, an hour had passed, and Greta suggested that they make an NA meeting that was soon to begin. Carol readily accepted the invitation, having developed a fondness and trust for Greta, and wanted to remain in her company. Carol called the hotel before they left the diner to leave a message at the front desk about her whereabouts, knowing that Deborah would be looking for her after she and Travis returned from their meeting with her Uncle Carl and Aunt Thelma. At the meeting, she was introduced to people that she instantly felt comfortable around, all of whom were actively working their program and supporting one another in their recovery from drug addiction. Carol was taken by surprise by the people she saw. They were mostly older people, with just a few younger than she was, and there were people from every nationality and every race at the meeting. Having become so accustomed to finding herself being only around black people while she was using, and even while in rehab, she only now realized that she'd come to believe that other people from other races never did drugs. Yet, here they were. These brief observations were good for Carol, and she felt the hope that here in Jacksonville, things were going to be different.